Right, so this video is going to cover the gustatory system. So gustation, again, is synonymous with taste. And we like to think of taste as all, that strawberry tasted like a strawberry. But in reality, again, as I mentioned in the previous little video, flavor is more complex than just taste, right? There's only actually 5 elemental tastes. Whereas most of what we consider flavor has to do with both the smell produced by chewing that food and having those odorant molecules bind to olfactory receptor neurons, but also how does it feel in your mouth? Like pizza and pizza-flavored Pringles have a different flavor, even though they're meant to taste the same. So 5 elemental tastes. We can group these into complex tastes and simple tastes. And I'll start with simple tastes. Basically what this means is it's just the protein that transduces this is just an ionotropic receptor. So basically what happens is for salty, we know salt is sodium chloride, right? So salty, the receptor is just a sodium leak channel. So it has it always has a conductance to sodium, and sodium entering the mouth via salt, sodium chloride, just directly goes into the cell and depolarizes it. So you get a simple way in which these sodium ions go right into the cell, depolarize them, and lead to the perception of salt. Very similar to that is sour. So sour is the same thing but acid, right? So if you eat something that's really acidic, your taste receptor cells are going to contain receptors that have a conductance to hydrogen ions. So they're like a hydrogen ion leak channel. Complex tastes actually act via metabotropic receptors. So metabotropic receptors. So, for example, bitter. Is a function of the binding of bitter tasted molecules. So things found in beer and coffee and like kombucha, stuff like that, that's going to be really bitter tasting. Those bitter tasted molecules are going to bind to what are called T2r receptors. So if you've ever done that test where you put the piece of paper on your tongue and determine whether or not you actually experience it, what you're testing is how many of these T2r receptors you have. That chemical is called prop, so it's 6N-propethiouracil. Don't memorize that. Sweet is going to be another complex taste in that it acts via metabotropic receptor. These are going to be your T1R2/T1R3. And what I like to do to remember this is just remember T1R, and then 23. And this will help because the last one is umami, which is kind of the perception of meat, like amino acids. Anything, when you eat a piece of steak or if you eat like tree nuts or anything with proteins in them, you're going to get activation of these umami receptors, which bind amino acids. And these are your T1R1/T1R3. So I think, it's T1R, but this time for umami, it's 13. I, to this day, haven't found a good way to remember that, but, whatever you think of is probably great. So these are receptors. These are complex metabotropic receptors. And there's another way we can kind of categorize these, which is that sweet, it's not big enough. Sweet, umami, and salty are inherently beneficial, and we know that. Like when you eat something that's salty, your brain knows that that's going to be good nutritionally. At least it thinks it knows that, right? Whereas sweet, something like sugar, is going to tell our body we're getting enough sugar, so we can do glucose metabolism. Umami, right? We need amino acids for proteins. What's weird is that bitter, the presence of things like bitter and sour, which are referred to as aversive tastes, are a bit of an anomaly because we don't really know why we enjoy those. And the theory with bitter, and it might hold true for sour as well, is that we don't enjoy bitter for the bitter. We enjoy bitter things because historically bitter things have been poisonous. And this may seem weird at first. So the idea is that plants produce bitter compounds so that animals don't eat them. And this is obviously, a really good method for the plants develops to not be eaten. But as it turned out, certain things like alcohol and coffee have these other effects, right? So at low doses, at doses that aren't lethal, things like coffee make you awake, and things like alcohol, make you have a good time, or whatever alcohol does for you. So what we think is that people don't really enjoy bitter because they enjoy bitter. They enjoy bitter because of, the other things that come with drinking bitter beverages or eating bitter foods. So, if you really enjoy IPAs, you might want to take a look at why you enjoy them. Is it because you really like the taste of bitter, or is it because it's alcoholic, which is most likely that? But then again, you can form positive associations in your emotional areas in your brain to this bitter taste. So who knows at that point? But yeah, so this is technically an aversive taste. So most animals in the animal kingdom would taste that and go, oh, not for me, because that's probably poisonous. For some reason, humans like to defy nature like that. So basically, the way the tongue is situated, here's your tongue. This is the front, or if I want to use anatomical terms, anterior. And then this is the back, so this is the posterior. You have these structures on your tongue referred to as papillae. That's too big. So papillae. Papillae contain taste buds. Taste buds contain taste receptor cells. They're called TRCs. These taste receptor cells contain the proteins that I talked about. So these receptors, like T1R2, T1R3 for sweet taste receptor cells, and each taste receptor cell corresponds to a specific type of taste. So there's sweet cells, there's bitter cells, there's salty cells, stuff like that. But the way the papillae are organized on the tongue is you have three main regions. So you have these kind of bumpy ones that exist all across the surface of your tongue. And if you spread blue food coloring on your tongue, you can actually see these. They don't soak up the dye. So you can use that to count them, which used to be my job in the lab that I work at. And it is a nightmare to count how many fungiform papillae 30 people have on their tongues. But basically, so these are the fungiform papillae. Right, and these contain those taste receptor cells, which contain the receptors. And these are actually, the information from these cells, the taste information, is carried to the central nervous system via cranial nerve 7. So this is the facial nerve. Cranial nerve 7. Facial. You also have these structures called foliate papillae. So these are foliate papillae. One thing I should mention, the fungiform papillae, each papillae itself contains around 100 different taste buds, or maybe even more. Whereas the foliate papillae, and the ones I'll talk about next, they're 2 to 3 taste buds per papillae. So the most anterior portion of the tongue is a lot better at tasting than the posterior portions of your tongue. But basically, these are going to be covered by cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal nerve. And as far as I know, also a little bit of cranial nerve 7. So I'll draw this so that we know that cranial nerve 7 encompasses that too. And what I can do, which will be better, is I'll highlight this. So cranial nerve 7 facial, that's going to cover everything I'm highlighting here. So most of the fungiform and a little bit of the foliate papillae. Whereas cranial nerve 9, which I'll make orange, that's going to be this stuff right here. And we have one last region, and I'm going to erase this just for space. These valley-looking papillae, which are called circumvallate. So I like to think that vallate means valley, although I don't know if it does. So circumvallate papillae. And these are carried by cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. And the way I remember this, and you do not have to do this if you're not one for mnemonics, but basically, so vagus, as you guys might know, means wanderer. So a vagus or a vagabond or anything that starts with that root means somebody who wanders. So what I do is it's the circumvallate papillae. So there's all these valleys and ridges, and I think of this guy wandering around them. He's just wandering in and out of these valleys, and he's going wherever he wants to go. But basically, he's circumnavigating the valleys of the circumvallate papillae, and because he's a wanderer, this is the vagus nerve. If that helps you, great. If it doesn't, ignore me. What else was I going to talk about for this? But so that's the tongue. This is cranial nerve 10, 9, and 7 are all responsible for carrying taste information to the central nervous system. And I guess what I'll talk about next is, where are these axons going to the central nervous system? So if here's your tongue, here's cranial nerves 7, 9, and 10. And they take slightly different routes, but for this class, I'm going to ignore that. And because they eventually all converge on a region in the brainstem, so this is the brainstem, called the nucleus of the solitary tract. And again, as I did with the olfactory one, I'm skipping the transduction part of this so that I can focus on the more big picture stuff. So you can, the transduction stuff, again, is just memorization. You can do that with the study guides. So this is the nucleus of the solitary tract. Basically, what happens is then the solitary tract itself projects to an area of the thalamus that you may already know of, which is the VPM. So remember that information, that touch information going to the face, or going to the, coming from the face, going to the somatosensory cortex, takes its pathway through the VPM. So this ventral posteromedial, it's pretty easy to remember that this is responsible for taste, because both the touch from your face and the taste from your face or your tongue is going to the same nucleus of the thalamus. So this is the ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. They then project to the primary gustatory cortex. So this is the gustation cortex, responsible for the conscious appreciation of taste information. And this is also called, this is the functional name is gustatory cortex. The anatomical name is the insular cortex. Right, but this isn't the only place this information goes. From the nucleus of the solitary tract, it also goes to the hypothalamus, and this is for information regarding nutrient availability. So your hypothalamus can then control things like feeding. Let's say you have your taste receptor cells are noticing there's a ton of sugar in your system, and there's also, so this is your tongue, but there's also taste receptor cells in your gut, so this is your gut, that also project to the nucleus of the solitary tract. So if they decide that there's, enough food in your stomach, this can lead to the hypothalamus actually inhibit feeding. Or if they decide that there's not enough food in your stomach, this can project from the nucleus of the solitary tract to the hypothalamus to increase feeding, or to say, hey, it's time to start feeding. And then definitely still do the study guide, because that'll help you with a little more of the nitty-gritty receptor type stuff. And yeah,